Caitlin and welcome to my channel. In today's video, I am doing my monthly reading recap and TBR for the upcoming month. I ended up reading so much in October and I am super excited to share that with you. This is how many books I read last month. I am honestly very proud of myself. I think this is the most books I've ever read in a month. And it's a total of 9 books, which is honestly insane for me. So let's go ahead and get into it. So the first book I read in October is called The Maidens. I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. This was like the perfect mystery because it had just the right amount of like scariness tied into it without it being like, okay, I'm just gonna get jump scared at every single chapter. It was enough that it like felt real, I guess, in a way. I don't really know how else to describe it. This book also has a like dark academia vibe, which made it a great read for October. So honestly, and this isn't a spoiler because it kind of explains this on the back, I feel like they could have leaned into the cult-like feeling a little more because there definitely were some chapters, some like moments where it felt very culty. But for the most part, it was kind of like a cliff note in all of the interactions and all of the murders. So I feel like maybe if that had been clued in a bit more, I would have been even more shocked by the reveal. And honestly, one of my only problems with this book is the shape. Because it is significantly smaller than most of the books I have and is like thicker, so when I'm reading it, I have to hold it like this, basically, which completely broke the spine, which honestly, for the most part, I don't usually mind, but because this is such a, like, short book, it's very, like, evident on the spine, which is, you know, not ideal, but it is what it is. The next book I read is Killer Instinct. I also gave this book 5 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. I love this series so much. I think it's so much fun. I think it's such an interesting concept, and I'm such a huge fan of Criminal Minds, and this really just kind of feels like the YA version of that, which is so much fun. In the first book, it really focused on the main character, which makes sense, but in this one we really got to dive into the backstories and relationships between all the other team members, which I thought was so much fun to read about, especially, what's his name? Dean. That was such an interesting story to like learn about, especially with the other FBI agents. So cool. I loved it. I cannot express to you how much I hate love triangles, but in this series it's perfect. In this series, I love it and it makes sense. Well, maybe not makes sense. That might be stretching it a little bit. But like, I don't hate it in this book is what I'm trying to say. I normally hate the love triangle trope, but in this one, it's tolerable. Also, I love that despite the fact that this is a young adult series, it's so hard to actually guess the ending, at least for me. And I love not being able to guess the ending. I love being shocked and surprised. The fact that this is for young adults and is still, like, difficult to figure out is so great. The next book I read in October is The Deal. I gave this book 3 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. And that's because I was honestly so underwhelmed by this book. Maybe I had just really hyped it up in my head and went in with super high expectations, but I feel like I always see such good reviews about this series, and honestly, I did not think this book was that good. I wouldn't say it was horrible necessarily, that's why I gave it 3, which is like, you know, the middle ground, but I was just kind of disappointed by how lackluster this book felt at most points in the plot. Also, another little detail that was really throwing me off, and honestly kind of pissing me off, was the fact that Elle Kennedy, the author, was constantly switching between actual curse words and replacement curse words in this book. And it wasn't like one character curses and the other one doesn't, so one of them is always using curse words and the other one is using replacement words. It's both of the characters, actually all of the characters, would cuss, but then would just randomly throw in replacement cuss words. Like, instead of dropping the F-bomb, they would be like freaking or fricking. And it was just like, why are we doing this right now? I'm probably still gonna read at least the second book in the series because I do want to give it the benefit of the doubt because, you know, sometimes the first book in a series can be a little misleading. So I am going to at least read the second book, give it a chance. But if it's not looking great after that, I might not finish this series. The next book I read was Leila, and I ended up giving this book 5 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. If you've watched a couple of my previous videos, you'll know that this book has actually been sitting on my shelves for like 2 years because I saw one of my favorite YouTubers recommend it, and then I got it, but I had gotten spoiled in that recommendation, so I kind of wanted to set it aside, and I had forgotten about it, basically, which was kind of nice, because for the most part I did forget the spoilers, even though there were a couple of things that I knew going in. Also, I think this book holds the record for like the fastest that I've ever read a book, and that is 2.5 hours, which is still insane to me. Like, it doesn't feel real that I read a book that fast. I'm honestly so glad that this book ended up I'm honestly so glad that this book lived up to the hype that the YouTuber Ava Jules was giving it. Because if I had waited this long and like let this book collect dust on my shelves just for it to be like mediocre at best, I would have been devastated. Especially after the last book I read, which was one that I had been anticipating and was not great. I would have been very upset. The next book I read is The Final Girl Support Group. I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. The concept and plot of this book was honestly so intriguing and not like anything I've really seen before. It might exist, but I had never read something like this before, and it was so good. I was able to call a couple of the plot twists throughout this book, but for the most part, I was completely shocked. Now, it has been a little bit of time since I read this book because I think I read it at the beginning of October or like the middle, so I might just not be remembering it quite well, but I think the killer's like motivation was really confusing. Spoiler alert, there were 2 killers technically in this book, and one of them just like really didn't make sense to me. I actually saw someone say online that they thought this would be better on the screen, like as a movie or as a TV series, and I could not agree more. Like, that made so much sense in my head because there's just so much action in this book that like would transfer so well to a screen. On to the next book. After The Final Girl Support Group, I read Nothing More to Tell, and I ended up giving it 4 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. Honestly, this author, Karen M. McManus, is very quickly becoming one of my favorite like mystery authors. She just writes so beautifully and so well. I just love it. Though honestly, the one thing I don't love about this author, from what I've seen of the couple of books that I have read from her, is that she cannot stop herself from leaving her books on a cliffhanger. I hate it when a book ends on a cliffhanger and there's no promise of a second book or like no hopes of a second book. It's just so annoying because I'm like, are we seriously just gonna leave it here and pretend like this couldn't completely change the course of like these characters' lives? Also, McManus really has a formula that she really likes to follow for most of her books, but for the most part, these books like are different enough from each other that it doesn't feel like predictable or like, oh, it's just the same story written over and over and over again. Next up, I read The Sun is Also a Star. I ended up giving this book 4 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. The plot of this book and the concept is genuinely so different from anything I've ever read before, and I'm absolutely obsessed with it. Like, I don't know if something like this existed before this book or if anyone has even tried to replicate it since it's come out, but it just seems like such an original idea and like so interesting and well thought out and so cool. I'm just like obsessed with the story of this book. One thing that I absolutely adored about this book, and that some books can get really wrong, is that the teenagers felt like teenagers. Like, they didn't feel like adults or like they were younger than they actually were. They just acted like teenagers. They miscommunicated like teenagers. They talked like teenagers. They acted like teenagers. Like, it just made sense, and it wasn't like too corny, but there like also were references to like social medias and stuff, so it just felt so right. Also, this author has the capability, I think, of taking any trope that I absolutely hate and making it into a trope that I absolutely love, because like I said a second ago, there is some miscommunication in this book, but it makes sense. As horrible as that is for me to admit out loud, it makes sense in this book. And another trope that I don't usually like is a short timeline, like the entire book happens in 24 hours. I think this entire book happens in under 24 hours, and it is so good. Like, I love it so much. The second to last book that I read in October is a dystopian classic, from what I understand, and that is The Maze Runner. I ended up giving this book 4 out of 5 stars. I actually don't know if I've talked about it on my channel before, but I read The Hunger Games for the first time ever, either at the beginning of last year or like the end of 2022, and felt absolutely in love with that series, and am so excited for the next book to be coming out. But I did not read a lot of like dystopian books when I was younger, like I know a lot of people in my generation did. So I've been trying to kind of catch up on everything that I missed, and The Maze Runner was on my list, and I just saw it at Barnes & Noble. It caught my eye, and I was like, you know what? I'm gonna try The Maze Runner, and so I did. I will say, I think one of the reasons that I didn't absolutely love this book and that it got 4 stars instead of 5 is because it was very clearly written by a man, and I mean that in the kindest way possible, because it's not a bad book, and I don't think that all male authors are like horrible, but you could just tell, you know, that it was written by a man, and as a woman, that was a little off-putting. And the last book that I read in October is The Haunting. I ended up giving this book 3 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. This was a good October read, especially end of October, because the timeline is kind of the week leading up to Halloween. However, I felt like most of this book wasn't really like plot. It was mostly like chase scenes and bodies dropping and people discovering bodies, and like a lot of tension that could lead up to something suspenseful, and not a lot of like actual explanation, I guess. I don't really know how to perfectly word what I'm trying to express. Also, I totally understand why the main characters weren't able to guess who the killer was, because even as the killer was being revealed, I was like, this is fake. This isn't happening. This is like a joke. They're playing a prank. But it was real. But it was real. Though I will say, something that made me honestly really angry was the fact that the female main character in this book didn't trust the cops for some reason. And quite frankly, had no reason to not trust the cops. Like, in some books, it makes sense. In some shows, it makes sense for certain characters to not want to go to the cops about a crime or about like a text message they received because they have tried to talk to the cops in the past and they've been like not trustworthy, or they've just kind of brushed them off as like, oh, you're just a little girl, like this can't actually mean anything. But the FBI was staking out her house to make sure she didn't get killed and was literally taking time out of their day to make sure she was safe. And she went out of her way to not ask for help. If the killer does not directly say, don't call the police, I'm calling the police, me personally. But what do I know? I mean, I'm not in a mystery book, obviously. This book ends on a cliffhanger, shockingly. And I was so angry that I docked an entire star off of the review for this book because I can't stand a cliffhanger when you know you're not gonna write a second book. But with that, that is all the books that I read in October. So now I am going to move on to my November TBR. Just like last month, I am keeping my actual TBR kind of short so that if I don't end up reading a lot, I don't feel like sad that I didn't meet my goal because I have such a small goal, I guess. The first book that I have on my TBR for November is Powerless by Elsie Silver. This is the third book in the Chestnut Springs series, and I love this series so much. I think it's so fun. Now that I've finally let the shock of a certain trope randomly appearing in the last book in this series, I am now okay. I have healed, and I am ready to move on to this book. And also, this is like the most perfect crossover ever because it's like a country cowboy romance, but the main male character is a hockey player. Like this is perfect for me. I have such high expectations for this book, and I'm a little scared of that. Honestly, I'm a little scared of that, but I am gonna be okay. The next book I have on my TBR is Sadie by Courtney Summers. This is another book that's been sitting on my shelves for a very long time, and because the two other books that I have on this month's TBR are romance books, I kind of wanted to spice it up with a bit of a mystery book. I don't think I've ever read anything else by Courtney Summers, so I am very interested to see if I like this author's writing. And the last book that I am going to be reading this month is none other than Funny Story by Emily Henry. Now, we're gonna ignore how large this book is for now. It is this size because the print is this size. So, yeah. All of my other Emily Henry books are paperbacks, and I really like having the same look for all of my books that are by the same author. So I really wanted a paperback version of this book, but I didn't want to have to wait until next year since this was a this year release. I didn't want to get like spoiled or anything. And I accidentally bought a book that's so big. So I'll probably end up donating this specific copy eventually when the actual paperback of this book comes out, and then buying that because this is just absurd. This is just absurd. Like, I don't know how else to put it. This is definitely another book that I have very high expectations for because it is an Emily Henry book. And I'm a little scared, honestly, because I have already seen some things that are like, this is the worst Emily Henry book yet, or like, this book is horrible. But I'm gonna try to go in with an open mind because I do, generally speaking, really like Emily Henry's books. So I don't want to be like persuaded by other people's opinions. And that is actually all of the books on November's TBR. I am genuinely so happy with the amount that I read last month, though, gotta be honest, towards the end of the month, before I read the last book, I was feeling myself getting into a bit of a reading slump just because of how much I had read. So I'm not sure I'm going to be reading that much again this month, but I'm still hopeful that I will exceed my written TBR. But that is all that I have for today's video. So if you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!